organizations here in DC, like DARPA, the US Navy, UK Home Office, and lots of private and public companies. And as a reminder, at the end, we'll try to take questions if there's time. So we'll take that through the Q&A feature. But without further ado, I'll turn this over to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for having me. Today, I have a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek talk about Newtonian physics, although I promise we will quickly move past any sort of discussion. So if I go to the next slide, please. Absolutely no surprise to anyone here, but I'm going to start with a legal statement. Do not buy stock in anything I say. I lie often. Nothing here is true. But more importantly, I'm not going to be talking about anything you should look at buying for. So thank you very much. And that is straight from my legal team to all of you, and I appreciate it. Next slide. Most of this has already gone over, so I'm not going to linger here, but probably the most important thing for this conversation is that, as Kevin said, I am now in a role where I am happy to run a strategic cybersecurity research team called SURGE. And we do quarterly research projects, and some of the things that we've been looking at, I think, are really relevant for this distinguished group of folks. And so I'm going to kind of be referring to a lot of that work over the next 30 minutes or 20, 25 minutes. And at the end of this, I will be sending out some references and documents that I'm kind of speaking over for the day. So I will post my bibliography probably in the Q&A. We'll figure that out. But as Kevin said, I have a long history of working in public sector. I've done a lot of collaboration back when I used to have a real job of doing cyber in the public sector. I used to live in Old Town Alexandria, worked in Ballston, did a lot of cyber collaboration across the river with wonderful folks across various parts of DOJ. And I'm very happy to be able to help out in any way I can today. Next slide. So quick agenda. I have a belief that everything we do in business, technology, and security creates opportunities as much as it causes problems. And that's really the thrust of this talk. Some of those three things we're going to talk about today are remote work, ransomware, and supply chain / cloud. And finally, I always like to do a call to action. I don't really see the point of me talking for 30 minutes if there's not something you're taking away. So I'll give you some practical take-home ideas. And then also, like I said, bibliography, where you can learn more about what I went over briefly today, dig in deeper, and hopefully get some more insights. Next slide. So I actually failed first grade math. That's not a joke. It's quite a surprise to my mother that I somehow work in a world that I do quite a bit of data science. I do machine learning. I do statistics. However, I'm not yet a rocket scientist, but this is as close as I'm ever going to get. So Newton's third law, right? We all know for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And I think this has come up in one of our offsites when I did a bit of a brainstorming session, and we were kind of discussing what should we look at next? Where should we try to focus our work? And the team that I run, Surge, we have a joking tagline of blue collar for the blue team. And what we mean by that is there's wonderful research groups out there that are doing incredible work on really esoteric mutexes from malware of the Palestinian Liberation Front that's targeting the Liberation Front of Palestine, and writing really exciting blogs, and it's wonderful work. I just always kind of go back and say, when I had a real job, did that help me, set my GPO settings? I distinctly remember when President Obama put out the executive order on detecting insider threat. That was just a huge amount of work, and I didn't have a lot of external resources to help with that. And so a lot of our ideas kind of start with this general point of let's really start broad and then dial in. And for this, we kind of went into Newton's third law. So if we go to the next slide, which I will grandiosely declare Kovar's third law of cyber. I'm not going to declare the first two. That's to find out later. But every action has an equal and opposite adversarial action. And what I mean by that is we in the security world focus on supporting a business. Now that business could be warfighters. That business could be, I work at Splunk, we sell software. That could be supporting the Treasury. That could be supporting the FBI. There's a lot of different options here. But at the end of the day, we in the cybersecurity world are protecting our customers, and our customers are internal and external. And a big part of what we're doing is we're always one step away, right? It's kind of N-1, if you will. The business wants to move faster. The customers want to have better email. I distinctly remember the days of BlackBerry and how excited we all were when we were all suddenly allowed to use BYOD, right? Bring your own device, bring your own phone. And that opened up a lot of business efficiencies, but it opened up a lot of adversarial abilities, right? And so I find that we tend to spiral, and we tend to, in the security world, focus a lot on the negatives. And so I thought today I'd kind of come to you a bit and talk about how these adversarial actions, both from the adversaries and perhaps our own customers, which sometimes quite frankly feel like adversaries, how you can actually turn those around and flip that frown upside down, if you will. So there we go. Heard it here first, Kovar's third law of cyber. So 3 new challenges, right? These are things that I think we've all dealt with in the last 2 or 3 years. The first being remote work, the second being ransomware. And IPv6, I talk about, I make a little joke about it because I remember when I learned IPv4, IPv4 was very difficult. It's one of those first things you learn, one of your first hurdles in the IT world. And then I had to learn IPv6, and I was like, this is horrible. And then I never used it again. And that was 2002. So I hope to retire before IPv6 is actually ever really fully adopted. And it's terrifying to me that we are in a trajectory that I may never actually have to fully learn IPv6 subnetting. So we're happy there. But the third part, of course, is cloud. I don't think there's anyone here who hasn't been dealing with or looking at cloud. So we're going to focus on these 3 areas that have greatly impacted the security community's life over the last 3, 4, 5, 10 years even, and then how you can actually find some good things and why it can really accelerate what you're doing in the cybersecurity world. Next slide. So this is a perfect example. I see 921 people on this WebEx right now. A good portion of you may very well have this exact posture. And it's stunning to me, right? Like, I worked in the government world for a very long time. The reason I actually work at Splunk today is my wife got a wonderful opportunity and we had to move to Dallas. And at the time I was working at DARPA in Ballston, Virginia. And I had a single workstation and a single SCIF and a single building. That's all I could do. There was no remote work options. I was also a contractor. I distinctly remember Snowmageddon, and it was, I could not get into work that day, and that was it. There was no options for remote work. One of the incredible things about the new world, the new reality, is everyone has moved to remote work because we had to, and that's opened up a lot of opportunities. But for those of you who've had to write policies and had to figure out a way to protect an organization when you're no longer dealing with a brick and mortar firewalls and endpoints, it really changes what you do. Next slide. We have a wonderful bit of data that we've worked on here at Splunk. It's called the State of Security Report. And one of the big things we did is we surveyed a couple thousand CISOs and security leaders around the world. And one of the biggest changes we've seen, this for me is a stunning stat, 21% of pre-pandemic workers were remote, and now 46% are remote working today. And we find this is only increasing. I happen to be in office today. This is literally the 7th time I've been in an office since 2021 or something like that, 2020. And more people are going remote consistently in my experience because we've gotten used to it, the flexibility. The world is still changing and it's modifying. But what we're also seeing is this is creating a lot of odd existence. How are you controlling the flow of documents? People logging on to their work computer and then their kids logging on to the work computer because they don't know the difference. And people are dealing with this in ways that we in the security field, we did not have any time to really think about this and come up with a strategic go-to-market plan over a 5-year work, right? It was kind of like, hey, we're all going to be back in the office next week till when this COVID thing blows over. And then 3 years later, 925 people sitting on the couch. Next slide. So we've already talked a lot about zero trust today and how that actually impacts folks, if I remember correctly. And I have found this to be one of those things that, the time has come. This is kind of like Linux on the desktop. I've heard about this concept. It wasn't called zero trust, but it was, this concept of being able to understand where things are. And it is difficult. And with remote work, no one's really sure 100% where they're going for that. But one of the nice things about zero trust is it provides that flexibility for people to work remotely, understand where things are, and have things with perimeters. So if we go to the next slide, One of the biggest advantages I always talk about when people come in, I work at Splunk. I'm a security guy who works at a software vendor. And oddly enough, I rarely ever talk about Splunk because what happens is when I come talk to customers or when I do research, we end up talking about core security decisions. And one of the biggest things that I'm a fan of is I ask people, have you done a qualitative or quantitative risk assessment of your network? And most organizations say no. It's a huge amount of work to do. Well, when you start having to move towards zero trust and having to move towards this new world of remote work, one of the first things you find that you have to do is actually classify your data. You have to understand where your work is, what the sensitivities are. One of the best things about the government is everyone already knows how to do this. Everyone is very familiar with classifications. If you're in the security world, you've had to deal with spillovers from classifications. You have things like data diodes. This is something that's bread and butter for the federal government, and I think this is an advantage that the government has, over public sector. Over when I talk to a Silicon Valley startup where data should be free, bro, and everything should be out in the wild. Like, no. When you're doing this, supporting your business, supporting your security customers, you have to have a better understanding of what your data is, where your assets are, and what that data and the classification sensitivity is. So my kind of, Kovar's third law of cyber here is remote work causes a lot of problems. But what's wonderful is this silver lining of being able to take the time and actually go through and say, oh, we're going to support you. But to do that, we need to have a better understanding of our assets and data and the importance to the business so we can better support this. And so I think this is a great example of how to turn that around and actually get a lot of value out of something that is kind of terrifying from a security point of view. Next slide. So I love this slide, if nothing else, and the great work done by the DOJ in the world. Ransomware. This is something that we've been facing a lot of across the entire sphere. I don't feel like I can go to a presentation. I don't feel like I can listen to a podcast or even pick up a newspaper without hearing about ransomware. And there's some things there that we'll go into where even though ransomware is absolutely horrible, there's some things that kind of actually help us out if we learn from them. So next slide. Once again, going back to the State of Security report, this is absolutely no surprise to anyone, a huge issue, both for the U.S. government, for customers, for everyone, for your grandmother in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Everyone is dealing with ransomware. And the level that people are or are not is what's shocking to me. In this report, one of the things we talk about, I don't show it here, but we asked CISOs like, oh, have you seen more incidents? Have you seen less incidents? And all of them have said like, oh, incidents are up hugely. And everyone was really surprised by that. I don't actually think that incidents are up in a huge amount. The difference is that with ransomware, people actually know that they were targeted. When I grew up doing cyber, it was, you didn't find out until you went hunting for them. Ransomware flips that on its head and comes back and says, not only did we compromise your network, you have to pay us to be able to get your network back. And so people are seeing this more because the evidence is put in front of their face. Next slide. So we went through, this is my lovely employee, Shannon Davis, and we decided to take a look at ransomware at a slightly different angle. There's already been a lot of great work done at, how ransomware works, the families involved, the ransomware as a service, the affiliate networks. But one of the questions we had was really around, okay, what happens when ransomware runs? How fast do you have? Can you recover? What is your options? And oddly enough, the only people we had found who had actually done a comparative analysis ransomware were actually adversaries. Lockbit ransomware, if you go to their Tor website, they actually do a comparative analysis of how much better they are and how much faster their ransomware is than 30 other people. And we saw, well, it's not really fair that the only people who've done this research are adversaries, so why don't we try it out? Next slide. So we took 10 ransomware families and we did 10 samples per family, and we did an empirical analysis. We ran this hundreds of times. We did it all in Splunk, which is quite a bit of fun. And we kind of went through and said, okay, let's look at these different variants and see how fast they go through and what differences they have. The next slide. And one thing that's very useful, I find, when I talk to folks about this, is that ransomware's median encryption time was 43 minutes across 53 gigs of files and 53 gigs of 100,000 files. The fastest, which was in fact Lockbit, was 4 minutes and 52 seconds. And that's a pretty big delta. And my argument would be for most organizations, it is almost impossible for them to react effectively in 43 minutes. The average dwell time for a ransomware family or a ransomware operator in a corporate network is 4 days. The amount of time that ransomware is actually active is the very end of that life cycle. Next slide. Why does this matter? And why can you be lazy? And I'm a huge fan of being lazy. I've made an entire career out of being extremely lazy. And what I mean by that is, why do something once when you can eat off that pig 5 times? There's a wonderful white paper produced by CERT New Zealand that got a little bit of attention, and I don't think nearly enough. And they have a good document here where they went through and researched and documented how ransomware lifecycle works, right? And when I first read this, I thought they had just copied it from the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain or MITRE ATT&CK. And the reality is that the modern ransomware lifecycle is almost identical to an APT kill chain. The difference is, at the very end, instead of trying to maintain silence and persistence on a system for years and exfil out intellectual property, they destroy the backups and encrypt the data and then send it out. So that's where the impact on target is different. But you'll see things like lateral movement, privilege escalation, command control. They're using Metasploit, they're using Cobalt Strike, they're using open vulnerabilities, they're using unpatched systems. These are all things we do every day. And so what I want to stress here is ransomware is a systemic threat to our entire existence for security, for organizations. It's changed the mindset in the game. But the reality is places can defend against ransomware using the same tools, the same techniques that they've already done before. We don't have to rethink things. You have to do patches. You have to have better credential management. You have to have defense in depth. You have to have zero trust. These are the things that we're already looking at doing. And when your bosses and when your executives and your SES come to you and say, what are we doing about ransomware? You should be able to look them in the face and say, we've got this. We have the tools at hand, and we don't have to get more things. We just have to execute better on what we're already doing and look at it from a 5-degree angle to the left, right? And I think that's the most wonderful way in the world to be lazy. Next slide. Now let's talk about cloud. And I'm not going to go into some of the things perhaps we're going to have other wonderful people talk about today. I'm going to talk a slightly different and kind of go into the software supply lifecycle or software supply chain about cloud. Next slide. So when I grew up doing cybersecurity, this is what my network diagrams look like, which I think I downloaded this from sadslides.com. We had endpoints, we had brick and mortars, we had data diodes, we had firewalls with demarcation points in Leesburg. I knew where to put my Zeek and Bro sensor. I had Snort and Suricata. In today's modern world of remote work, I'm not 100% sure where to put a lot of this data. And that's kind of difficult. And this cloud aspect is really impacting a lot of our lives, and much of it in a much better way. I find that, the average organization, if they're depending on Amazon cloud security, they're in a much better place than just depending on Bob, who does security patching on Tuesdays when he can get around to it, right? Next slide. So once again, going back to the State of Security report, one of the big things we asked was, how much are people using cloud? And not surprisingly, almost everyone is. Perhaps a little bit surprising is most organizations use multiple public clouds. Now, I would push back a little bit upon this statement because I find that most places have a dominant cloud. They are a 95% Amazon shop and a 5% Office 365 Azure. But at the end of the day, they still have to defend and protect against multiple different cloud platforms in different places. And that consistency across data centers and cloud and trying to understand the security controls is hard. Next slide. And one of the things that I think has to be rethought is, as a network defender, like I said, someone who grew up with Cat5 cables and Cisco firewalls and doing ACLs, and that's how you started defense. A network defender now has to also think in the realm of DevSecops, because the world of cloud, and this is an interesting, perhaps tenuous link, but you can't actually talk about cloud anymore and say someone else's data center. For years, I thought I understood cloud, and I was just like, I don't know why people are so into this. Cloud is just someone else's data center. Like, does it really matter if it's in an Amazon data center instead of my data center? And I was talking to someone, and it was a customer, and they were asking me about how they could defend against Lambda functions. And I said Lambda functions, and they looked at me and said Lambda functions, not pregnancy breathing. And I said, oh, and I had to go do a lot of research. And one of the biggest things I went through and learned was this concept of ephemeral services and how the modern cloud is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of ephemeral services that are being put in through a CI/CD pipeline and what that means. And I suddenly realized that my entire career, I was a defender, and I needed to learn an entire new area of network defense called DevSecops. Next slide. And these are some of the areas that I kind of go through. And I spent time just documenting what this means and how what a network defender looks at is slightly different than what a DevSecOps persona would look at. And today, I think those are two different people. I think as time goes on in the next 5 years, we're going to find that the majority of organizations that have a security team are going to have to be completely savvy on DevSecOps and what that means. And part of this is I have a concept of supplier and consumer. Any company is actually a supplier and a consumer of software in the modern world. And you may not think this. You may not think that the Department of Justice is a creator of software. But one of the most incredible software developers I ever met was a 72-year-old woman who was an accountant. And she had written a VBA for an Excel spreadsheet that was 5,000 lines. And this automated 6 people out of jobs. And she would never call herself a computer scientist. She had never learned it, but she had learned how to do this to do her job better. And this was actually an incredible tool, but it was an intro into the network for basically adversarial actions because it was a macro. And we had disabled macros across the network, and it broke this process. So I say this because, it's not just companies like Splunk that write formal software. Every company in the world at this point is basically creating software, and we have to be cognizant of that. Next slide. So there's a wonderful bit of work done by Google called Salsa, SLSA, and they kind of break through the software supply chain methodology and where you need to look through for figuring out what this is. So something I would say here is I went through and just said, hey, these are the areas that Salsa can be done by both and that are only done by DevSecOps. And this detection idea is important, and having a cognitive thought model to be able to arrange your discussions around security in the cloud and DevSecOps is important. And for many of us, myself included, this is new. I didn't grow up with this, and it's complicated, and it's not something you can necessarily build easily off your existing knowledge base. But there are some advantages. Next slide. I give this example of this is something that our threat research team does internally at Splunk. They're a wonderful group of folks who create detections for our premium product suite, Splunk's threat research team. And they use a CI/CD pipeline for detections. They have an automated methodology for building up a range that they can actually test things in. It builds up in about 5 minutes. It builds an entire network with a Splunk Atomic Red team. It can be deployed to Azure and AWS. It builds up Linux, Unix. So you can automate detections, and then you can automate the attacks and have this completely tested and run and done in less than 6 minutes. It is incredible. And the reason this works so well is they've adopted a CI/CD pipeline methodology of how to run detections in a cloud methodology using modern software development ideas. And so I say this to illustrate a point that you can look at the things needed for CI/CD pipeline and DevSecOps in cloud and stop thinking of it as the other and rather start thinking of how do we adopt this new methodologies to actually increase our own ability to execute defenses. Next slide. So I have a couple minutes left with you, so I'd like to leave with you some conclusions, a little bit of room for time for questions if appropriate. Next slide. The biggest, going back to the beginning of the talk, Kovar's third law of adversarial actions. New problems are hard, but you can actually begin looking at them as ways to create opportunities for your own team. This could be taking the best knowledge from them. This could be, the silver lining, the long story of no breach goes without a silver lining for more funding. If you take that to the next level extremes, we would love to go to zero trust, but first thing we need to do is really have a better idea of where your data is and what ability to, what we need to look at and what are the risks. The cyber baby out with the bathwater. By this, of course, I mean, look at things that you can do to eat twice on the same meal, right? What can we get more advantages out of as we kind of go through this area? And then finally, defense in depth, Cyber Sun Tzu talked about it. Clausewitz talks about it. Defense in depth works. The concept of zero trust beyond core, it makes a big difference when you start taking that to the logical extremes of using CICD pipeline, software supply chain, all these sort of areas for cloud. You really begin to get more advantages of where you can actually do your defenses, especially if you've taken the time to do a qualitative or quantitative assessment of your data classifications. So there's all great places to combine this through and have a more powerful outcome. Next slide. Finally, as promised, these are some of the references I talked about. If you're interested, I think they're great things to read through. The work by CERT New Zealand is top-notch, and I believe I'll be posting this in the Q&A somehow, or we'll be emailing this out afterwards for anyone who'd like them. Finally, next slide. Thank you so much for all being here. I'm pretty active on Twitter. Also, we do a lot of stuff on LinkedIn Live, various other places. So if you're interested in this, you want more things from me, feel free to follow along, MeanSec on Twitter, and really appreciate everyone's time and happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kovar. That was really great. We do have a couple of questions clamoring for your attention. First up, what are the most critical actions agencies can take to improve their logging capabilities?
Oh, obviously full adherence to OMB memos. I think if I take that question and turn things, what I think is the biggest advantage any security team can do is there's a huge disconnect for the majority of security organizations who actually know how GPO works, group policy in active